Writing was invented roughly 5,000 years ago, roughly the same time in Egypt and in southern Babylonia. In the earlier pre-Arab world in ancient Egypt, there are complicated stories and side stories.
David Damrosch is a professor of comparative literature at Harvard University. He's also director of Harvard's Institute for World Literature. He's gathered some of his favourite works together in a book called Around the World in 80 Books. In January 2020, you were planning an epic trip around the world. Then came COVID-19 and that trip ground to a halt. What happened next?
Well, I decided, after feeling very frustrated that I couldn't go to all these places, I could go around my study in 80 books.
Two of the books in this chapter are the religious scripture for the Jews, the Hebrew Bible, and the religious scripture for Christians, the New Testament. Why have you included it in this?
Mm-hmm.
Or both of them, yeah.
Yeah. Well, partly, always in my book, I'm interested in connecting contemporary world literature to its ancient roots. Also, I say it with Islam, these three Abrahamic faiths that all come out of the same region. And of course, in the Quran, we know that Abraham and David and Jesus are prophets in this whole tradition. It all becomes incorporated, however differently interpreted.
Fariduddin Attar, The Conference of the Birds, is another book that you pick. The way you describe it is as one of the greatest narratives of spiritual quest and fulfillment.
That's what? Yeah.
Can you tell us the story? Welcome to Muslim Footprints, a deep dive into Muslim civilizations through the ages, accompanied by some of the best experts in their field. I'm thrilled to introduce you to the first episode of this new season, Tales from Muslim Lands. In January 2020, you were planning an epic trip around the world. You wanted to survey the global landscape of literature, loosely tracing Phileas Fogg's journey from London through Asia, across the Pacific to the Americas, and finally back to London. Then came COVID-19 and that trip ground to a halt. What happened next?
Well, I decided, after feeling very frustrated that I couldn't go to all these places, following Phileas Fogg and Around the World in 80 Days, I could go around my study in 80 books. So I made a blog over the course of that summer, 5 books a week for 16 weeks, giving myself the fiction of weekends in between. And so I visited all these 16 parts of the world in literature.
How did you pick the books?
It was a mixture of places I thought would be interesting, how books help shape our sense of the world in different locations. Also, authors who I thought were responding to the world. They were global authors in some way. Either they go out into the world or they bring the world in. Often travel and voyaging was a theme. I was also interested in the ways in which writers process their own personal traumas or the difficulties of their society, the tensions, into literature. And there was also the pleasure principle, just a number of my very favorite books.
And how did you pick the geographies?
Well, I needed to start in London because in Jules Verne's novel, that's where Phileas Fogg starts. He goes more or less along the trade routes of the British Empire at the time. I needed a more global reach, but I started there and in Europe, and then I went to the Middle East and Africa and South Asia, East Asia, then back to the Americas, and then back across the Atlantic to come back to London.
So we're going to focus on 3 of those chapters that lend themselves very well to Muslim civilizations. So the first is the Middle East. The theme that you have for the Middle East is stories within stories. Tell us how you picked that.
And I've always been fascinated with the complexity of storytelling in the Arab world. And indeed, in the earlier pre-Arab world in ancient Egypt, there are complicated stories and side stories.
So let's start with ancient Egypt, which are among the first stories ever written.
Absolutely. Writing was invented roughly 5,000 years ago, roughly the same time in Egypt and in southern Babylonia. And the Egyptian hieroglyphics is a system that I've been interested in for a long time. I studied Middle Egyptian in college already. And I fell in love with Egyptian poetry and also the pleasures and complexities of Egyptian narrative already 3,000 and 4,000 years ago.
So this includes love poetry and wisdom literature.
Love poetry, wisdom literature, and fictional tales, so all together. And the love poems are very charming. They're some we find on pieces of pottery. Others were put on scrolls, put in tombs to entertain the royalty in the afterlife. Titles like the Songs of Excellent Enjoyment. And then at the same time, they have the religious texts of spells to guide them through the afterlife. They have extensive wisdom texts. And they have these delightful stories. One called The Story of the Shipwrecked Sailor, in which a captain has come back to Thebes, having failed in an expedition up the Nile. His sailor says, "Oh, it's not so bad. Let me tell you what happened to me one time. I survived difficulty." He describes being shipwrecked on this island of the spirit, the Ka. He meets a magical serpent, and he says, "Oh, please don't kill me, serpent." And the serpent says, I'm not going to kill you. I'm a generous God. Let me tell you what happened to me one time." So you get a story inside a story inside a story already 4,000 years ago, and one of the very first stories ever recorded. And probably the most famous ever text on this theme is The 1001 Nights, which I wanted to have a centerpiece of this chapter.
The interesting thing here, well, there's many interesting things, but there's many different manuscripts of The 1001 Nights. How did that come about?
So originally, all around the area, people were telling stories, and gradually there started to be collections. Probably the first version of The 1001 Nights is a Persian collection, probably 1,500 years ago, and that's why the frame tale characters, Shiraz, Shahryar, Shah Zaman, those are all Persian names and not Arabic names. And gradually this circulates, gets disseminated. A bunch of the stories are set in Baghdad, but then as we have them, the texts develop in different standards of storytelling, particularly Cairo and Damascus. There are different manuscript traditions, and they keep changing. It's the nature of oral tradition that it continually elaborates. So the stories never end.
Tell us what the premise is of this book.
The 1001 Nights. Well, it's a very interesting text because it's really a story about storytelling. So you have the Shah, who's become morbidly obsessed with infidelity that he and his brother have both experienced. He starts marrying every night another woman, having her executed the next day. After enough time, so many murders have happened. His vizier is in despair, but his vizier's daughter, the wise and beautiful Shahrazad, says, "Let me be the next one. Maybe I can stop this." And she starts cleverly having her sister, Dunyazad, say, "Oh, tell me another story," just before they would fall asleep. And she keeps the stories going night after night, not quite ending it so that the king will want to hear the next story. After 3 years, she's produced children for them, but also 1001 Nights of Storytelling. And it's really the first talking cure, because the king at the end says, "Oh, I'm now cured."
What are some of the tales in the 1001 Nights, and were they in the first version?
Some of the famous ones are, and some came in very late. Quite interestingly, when it was first translated into a European language in French by Antoine Galland in the early 18th century, he added in several tales that he heard from a Syrian storyteller in Damascus, including Aladdin, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, were never there before. Now they're there in Arabic editions translated from the French.
The next book that you look at, or the next author that you look at, is Nagib Mahfuz. Tell us why you chose him, and tell us who he is and why you chose him.
Well, I'm interested to introduce readers both to major authors that they should know or might know, as well as to lesser known figures. Mahfuz has become certainly very famous since he won the Nobel Prize, the first Arab winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature. And he's also an author I'm very fond of. And the book I chose, Arabian Nights and Days, directly plays off against, of course, The 1001 Nights.
Right, so this particular book that you chose of Nagib Mahfuz starts on the 1002nd day.
Yes, it is set back in what I suppose is Baghdad, but it looks a lot like modern Cairo, except it's still the old characters. And you have now, yes, on the 1002nd day, the vizier is very concerned how it's all gone. He wants to go find out. He thinks, oh, the Shah is all cured. And Shiraz says, well, I did everything I could, but he's still an autocrat. There's still bloodshed. Nothing has really improved. So it's very kind of satirical about contemporary world as much as it's looking back at the past.
And then what happens?
In the end, the king decides to abdicate power because it's been too corrupting.
So that was the whole premise of of
Mahfuz's book at the end.
I see. So Mahfuz is Egypt's most prominent kind of chronicler of daily life. It's been challenging for him to be an author.
Yes, he is a very complicated figure, and he's also of interest to me because he's such a multicultural, international figure. In his Nobel Prize speech, he says he's the child of three cultures, one of which is Islam, one of which is the pharaonic Egyptian culture of 7,000 years, and only the third of which is Western culture. All three blend together. And people who are too concerned to identify Egyptian culture with one politics or one particular tradition often found him too various, too unorthodox, too uncertain. So he ran afoul of trouble politically as well as religiously.
Another author that you have chosen is Orhan Pamuk. Tell us about him.
Well, Pamuk is another interesting case. I used him partly in this case because the book I picked, My Name is Red, is full of play off against 1001 Nights. He has a heroine named Shekure, who is like a Shahrazad figure, but it's also the name of his own mother. And she has two sons named Orhan and Shevket, which is Orhan's brother's name. At the very end, she bequeaths her tales to her son Orhan, and she says, but watch out when you read it, because for the sake of a good story, there's no lie that Orhan would not tell. So it's very funny. But also, I talked to him about Mahfuz. He says he's very devoted to Mahfuz. He has a whole Mahfuz library. So he also is someone like Mahfuz who's interested in thinking about the conflicts, tensions, and communication across cultures.
And how does that play out in My Name is Red?
So in this book, he talks about these cultural issues in terms of visual art. He himself planned to be a painter for years until in his 20s he abandoned painting and became a novelist. And he decided to write about his childhood in the 1950s by changing the dates to the 1590s. He simply switched 2 digits. And there he's talking about painters in the Ottoman court in Istanbul who are painting miniature pictures to illustrate poems and stories and Quran. And there's a conflict between painters in a traditional style, a very Persian-derived style, very not realistic, but sort of exemplary. A conflict with that and the new European style coming in from Italy of realism, which the traditionalists think is too secular. It's not connecting to the divine or to the sort of elevated state. And so there's a murder mystery going on among the rival miniature painters. And
what's the conclusion?
The conclusion is that, not to give away too much of the plot, but one of the painters has been murdered by another painter, one of his rivals. And it's a very amusing murder mystery. It starts the very first pages. The corpse is complaining about his death and wondering who killed him. So we have to try with the corpse to solve the mystery as it goes on.
And the message that he wanted to put across were the tensions between old and new.
The tensions between old and new. One of his purposes was also, I think, to try to make his contemporary, largely secular Turkish readers appreciate the pre-modern tradition. He loves the old Sufi traditions. He loves the old Persian miniature traditions, these older art. One of the things that happens in Turkey is, of course, with the huge reform that happens in the 1920s, the language reform in particular, which has been called a catastrophic success by one scholar, you lose the ability to read the old Ottoman texts. And
yes, no, tell us tell us about that language reform. It was.
Yeah, so Kemal Ataturk really wanted to reorient Turkey towards the West, so he is abandoning the Persian Arabic alphabet and also de-Arabizing the language a lot, vocabulary. And he's so it's both a Europeanizing gesture and a nationalist gesture. He wants a Turkish language oriented towards Western Europe. And Pamuk is one who's very much a modern writer, but he doesn't want to be caught being a kind of imitation Western European. He's connecting the older traditions and the modern traditions. And in a certain way, his message is you should try to find creative ways to combine both. So he's writing a novel, which is a fundamentally European form, and he's often written about feeling he's writing novels when he's distant from the centers of the creation of the traditional novel. But he's also now himself writing 53 short chapters, each one of which is like a miniature portrait of someone in their voice. So it's combining a kind of Persian miniature tradition with the Western novel.
And the final author for the Middle East section was Jokha Al Harthy from Oman. How did you pick an Omani author?
In January 2020, I was just going to be starting this project, finally, after thinking about it for a long time. And I had to go to a conference in Muscat. And I encountered this wonderful novel published translated just the previous year by Jokha Al Harthy, called Celestial Bodies in its English translation. And I thought it was a wonderful novel. And I thought this would be really interesting, partly because it too plays on 1001 Nights. It features three sisters who are trying to deal with making their way in a very modern globalized world, but also a very patriarchal world that still has pulls towards long-standing traditions that they both share, but also want to change or get away from. It's a bit of 1001 Nights quality. There's a great sequence of stories early in 1001 Nights, which I talk about already in that section, on a porter and three ladies of Baghdad. So these are like the three ladies of Muscat instead.
And she has an interesting story of how she got published.
Yes, this is interesting to me about world literature and how it moves in the world. So Jokha Al Harthy herself was up in Scotland getting a PhD in Arabic poetry. She went away to get an academic PhD to come back to teach in Sultan Qaboos University in Oman. But she was wanting to write. She's writing, and she was feeling not completely comfortable in English, and she loved Arabic so much she wanted to write a novel in Arabic. So she's writing this while doing in English her dissertation, and she shows this draft novel to her advisor, a woman named Marilyn Booth, who is also a translator, and Booth offered to translate it. Now, no major publisher wanted to publish the first novel by an Omani woman writer. They didn't think there was a market. A small publisher, Scottish publisher, published it, and then wins the Man Booker Prize for the best translated work published in English that year and becomes an international bestseller. So I think that world literature is often a matter of networks, of connection, as you say, often by chance, serendipitous, often not planned. And I think a number of the authors I'm interested in think that the things you plan are never as important as the things that happen by accident.
Let's move on to another chapter, Israel and Palestine. The theme there is strangers in a strange land. Where did that come from?
Well, the first work that I talk about in that chapter is the Hebrew Bible, and that phrase comes from the book of Exodus, in which Moses names his son Gershon because he says we've been strangers in a strange land, in his case, I guess, meaning Egypt. But in a way, also when they come back towards Palestine, they're now strangers there. They've been away for so long. And his son Gershon, ger means stranger, or really like resident alien, like guest worker. It's a very kind of contemporary issue as much as anything else. One of my themes in that chapter, as in a good deal of my work, is to try to show the deep connections among the divergent cultures in the area. After the events of 9/11, I got very frustrated by this stupid discourse in the United States about a clash of civilizations. I thought, if you go back far enough, it's one civilization that develops into different cultures. So I wrote a book on the Epic of Gilgamesh for general readers because it has offshoots up in the Bible and in Homer and in the 1001 Nights. So also with the Hebrew Bible, I'm already interested in showing how there's an interaction of cultures, languages, and perspectives in that great text.
Two of the books in this chapter are the religious scripture for the Jews, the Hebrew Bible, and the religious scriptures for Christians, the New Testament. Tell us the context in which both of these were written.
Within the general context of this area as being almost always under the thumb of one or another foreign empire, whether it's Egypt or it's Babylonia, whether it's Persia, whether it's later the Romans. And this is very much the case also with the New Testament, where then it's a Roman Judea. And Christianity both is partly a response to the kind of repressions that people are feeling. They need some new direction. So with the Hebrew Bible, it then gets put together as we have it during the Babylonian exile that happens in the 6th century BCE.
What is that? Tell us what that is.
Palestine is overrun, and the elites are deported to Babylon for 70 years. And I think that's where they actually learn how to write. Because if you're like a scribe in the ancient Levant in Palestine, the captivity was a disaster politically, but it's the best thing that could happen to a writer. It's like you're being exiled from, I don't know, Kansas to Paris. It's like, wow, this is the center of writing, the center of culture. I think that's where they learned how to be great writers.
In Babylon?
I think so.
Because that was an advanced, developed...
So far advanced, yes, exactly. The center of writing culture, one of the first texts, the first libraries, all kinds of the first schools are all there in Mesopotamia.
Which is now?
Now Iraq. Now Iraq. Baghdad, and then Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, a little further north, which is where we have the text of the Epic of Gilgamesh been recovered from there. So the Hebrew Bible gets put together during the exile and the centuries immediately afterwards, when really the country has been destroyed as a political independent power, and the people increasingly mobilize around their religion, especially around a book. Then under the Romans with the New Testament, you have, again, an imperial setting and movements. There are many different strands. Some which saying the world is going to end, some which saying we need a temple, some which saying no, we just need scripture. And Jesus comes as a kind of a reform rabbi from within that tradition.
Is it possible to talk about characteristics that differentiate them, or characteristics that they have in common?
So the Jesus and the gospel writers all see themselves as heirs to the Hebrew Jewish tradition, but then they're increasingly trying to figure out, well, how are we going to be different? We don't want to have these 613 laws. We want to have a couple of laws, like love your neighbor and love God. That should be enough. In a certain sense, Islam is very much an heir to that. To be a Muslim, that does not require detailed knowledge of hundreds and hundreds of laws, right? There's a profession of faith. So we see that movement as part of that. Then it's also in a Greek world increasingly, or it's a multilingual world where now Greek is predominating. Already by Jesus' time, a lot of upper class Israelites were reading the Bible in Greek, which was translated because they weren't that good in Hebrew anymore. So increasingly it's written for a Greek audience with kind of Greek ideas, a kind of cosmopolitan audience. So no longer is religion seen as the property of one people with one chosen people. Now it should be for all people. That would be certainly the biggest difference between the two traditions already at that early period.
And there's a nice example that you give about, was it the Gospels written for different audiences?
Yes.
At different times?
Yes. So within a fairly few decades, this new movement goes from being a sect within Judaism to being some new universalizing religion that is increasingly for everybody who wants it, rather than for people who are, the sons of Jewish mothers, as in Judaism. So the first Gospels that are written down 30 or 40 years after Jesus' death, when people are realizing, well, the world hasn't ended yet after all, we should record these things we've just been talking about. And the first two Gospels written according to Matthew and Mark, Jesus' last words on the cross are, my God, why have you forsaken me? Then just 10 or 20 years later, the Gospel of Luke changes that. Jesus' last words are, unto you I commit my spirit, speaking to God. Then the fourth Gospel, written at the end of the century by John, gives that altogether. It just says, it is finished. It is completed. That's what Jesus says. So what's the difference? The difference, I think, is the spread of the religion beyond its original Jewish base. Because the first two gospel writers are writing really for Jews. And what Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me, is not a cry of existential despair, not possible. The gospel writers could not have thought that, did not think that. It is a quotation from one of the Psalms of David, in which David has been driven out of Jerusalem by his rebellious son Absalom, and he says, my God, he does a prayer to God. That's the first line, which goes on to, but you will save me, you have always saved those who are faithful. So it's about restoration in a time of difficulty. Now, Matthew and Mark expect their readers will get that. You say the first line, you know the whole thing. And I'd like to imagine that Jesus might well have said that in his agony on the cross. He's reciting a psalm just to stay, strong. But then Luke is writing for a Greek audience primarily, a mixed audience who may not, some Jews will recognize the Psalms, a lot of his readers will not. And he doesn't want that line because it can confuse people, as it does to this day if they don't know the psalm. So he takes, into your hands I commit my spirit, which is a line from another psalm. So it fits for both audiences. Then John, for a purely Greek audience, doesn't care about the Psalms at all. So already just within a few decades, you see this very local tradition becoming a world tradition, becoming world literature.
Tells us the importance of context.
Absolutely.
So just like your other geographies, the rest of your book choices for the Israel and Palestine section shed light on the issues of the region. The first is D.A. Mishani, which is The Missing File. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a detective novel from Israel, and the genre itself has had some challenges in Israel. What are those challenges?
Yes, Mishani talks about that. He builds into his novel. His hero is a guy named Avi Avraham, a detective from a kind of lower working class group. And he loves detective stories. He's obsessed by them. He always thinks that the detective gets the story wrong. He knows better than the author what really happened. The little joke on him is that he's mistaken about the murder mystery he's investigating. He gets it wrong himself. But he says early on to one of his colleagues, well, you know why there's no murder mysteries here in Israel? It's because everybody knows who done it. There's no mystery. And he happens to be wrong in this case. At the same time, for Mishani, the detective story is also an opportunity not only to work in a genre that's underrepresented in Israel, where they like more political thrillers, but also because the detective genre is the most global that there is. And as a writer from a small country in a small list spoken language, a way to reach an international audience is by an international genre, the detective story, because they often get translated and circulated.
But there's also something else about him writing, or about the kind of absence of detective novels in Israel. Can you tell us a bit about that and the kind of social, I suppose, the social situation that represents?
Yes. So one of the things that Mishani thematizes is that there's a real split between the upper tiers of the government and the workaday cops on the beat. Your typical hero of a detective story is just the gumshoe, the detective, the low level guy. But in Israel, the upper administration are all Jews of European origin, and many of the detectives are Mitzrayim people from Arab-speaking countries. People grew up, or their parents grew up speaking Arabic, in fact, and they're viewed as working as less second-class citizens, basically. And so their stories are not interesting. What happens to those people is not interesting. His story is taking place in a working-class suburb of Tel Aviv, where Mishani is from himself. People of no great, interests, of no great prestige. And he's interested in particular in an abused wife who's forced into lying about what's happened in this story, really unpacking the complicated family relations in sort of hard scrabble, difficult situations.
Is this something unusual in Israeli fiction to talk about social issues? Is there more of an emphasis on big national problems?
I would say that Mishani is part of a younger generation that has moved away from the very heavy emphasis on the nation as a theme, the creation of a nation, and also on biblical themes that were often the case in either biblical themes or secular Zionist themes that were often the case in the generation after the establishment of the State of Israel, and more towards social issues and tensions within either in the Jewish community or also between Arabs and Jews in Palestine, as we see in other books in the chapter, The Secret Life of Said, the Pesoptimist, the great novel by Emil Habibi.
Let's talk about this this novel now. So Emil Habibi is a Palestinian Christian who served in the Knesset for the Palestinian Communist Party. Tell us what he was writing about.
So Said the Pesoptimist interests me among other reasons because it's a work of world literature that's in dialogue with a work of world literature, namely Candide by Voltaire. Candide, the subtitle is The Optimist. Candide believes it's the best of all possible worlds, and Voltaire is satirizing the idea that everything has been perfectly arranged by God. How can this possibly be? In Habibi, Said and his family are the Pesoptimists, because for Palestinians, optimism is too much to hope for. But a mixture of optimism and pessimism is maybe a little bit more realistic, so it's a Pesoptimist. And he has a series of misadventures, and everything always goes wrong for his family, and they're all kind of compromised morally in some way, either sexually or politically or both. And it's a satire on both absurd, ungrounded hopefulness, but also a political satire against the repressive Israeli regime, and also a satire against Arab elites around the area who are perfectly willing to let the Palestine situation percolate as it does for their own interests.
What's the message, if there is one, from his writing?
So it's an interesting mixture of realism and science fiction, actually, in a certain way, because Said either has been or he's crazy and thinks he has been abducted by aliens. So he has conversations with aliens who are trying to understand what's this weird country that no alien can possibly understand, which is interesting. So the aliens are themselves the strangers in a strange land, too.
And what is his, does he say what he thinks the way out should be?
It's a very interesting issue. So he's writing in Arabic, but as an Israeli citizen. His book won prizes, both an Arab literary prize, but also in translation an Israeli literature prize. He was criticized by various of his friends for even accepting the Israeli prize. But he said he felt that a dialogue of prizes is much better than a dialogue of stones and bullets. And he really advocates resistance to oppression, particularly Israeli, but also by upper classes that are generally oppressing the lower classes, and that is his communist leanings undoubtedly are there, and also part of the internationalism. It's not a local problem only; it's a worldwide problem of class struggle as he sees it.
And finally, you chose Mahmud Darwish, the Palestinian poet. How did you come across Darwish?
Darwish I first encountered because for a long time I taught at Columbia University, where for a quarter of a century I was in the department with Edward Said, a great Palestinian activist and a scholar of European literature primarily. And he was a friend of Darwish's, and one of Said's books called After the Last Sky, a beautiful book, meditation on a series of photographs of daily life in Palestine. After the Last Sky is a line taken from a poem by his friend Darwish. So I already got interested in Darwish then, and I included a bunch of Darwish's poems in an anthology I did of world literature, where one of my purposes in that anthology, in the wake of 9/11, was to have more Middle Eastern, more Arabic literature, more Islamic literature than had ever been in an American anthology for college students. So Darwish, I loved his work. I also wanted to have poetry as well as prose. Too many people reading world literature just reading novels. It's important to me to have a significant poet. And Darwish is also nice because he's a figure of exile, fits this theme of being a stranger in a strange land, either in his own case. He and his family were sort of expelled during the takeover, the formation of Israel, and their village was destroyed. They were allowed to come back, like to Jaffa, but they're like absent presences. It's a weird category.
There was no more village.
Their village had been destroyed. So they're within Israel, but they no longer have a home. So that's already a theme for him. And then he spent much of his life literally in exile elsewhere, Paris and elsewhere. So it's a kind of a double form. And I should say that years before I did this book, our son was teaching in a high school outside Amman. He'd majored in Arabic and was teaching history and religion in a junior high school. And when he got his first paycheck, this is his first job after college, he had a friend of his who does mosaics, make a mosaic with a line from Mahmud Darwish, an elegy that Darwish wrote for Said on Said's untimely death. And it's about Said, and the line is, he thinks of the journey of ideas across borders, a perfect world literature theme by Darwish.
Darwish problematizes exile. So on the one hand, it's this idea of being separated from your home. That's like a sadness that can never be surmounted, no matter what success you have. But then in exile, you also have freedom. Does that come through his poetry?
Absolutely, and it has. It comes up very clearly in this beautiful elegy that he wrote for Said, which in English translation is called Counterpoint. And you can see him on YouTube reciting it in Arabic very beautifully. His hands are extremely expressive, and it's been well translated. And he talks about Said with kind of affectionate irony as someone who has become somehow very Victorian British, and yet he's a Palestinian. And in some sense, Said was always aware of this indelible loss of his childhood home, but also he gains a multiple perspective, including his ability to intervene on behalf of Palestine with world audiences from his multiple perspectives.
So the final chapter is about Persia. So you've called it Tehran to Shiraz. And one book is Persepolis by Marjan Satrapi that you chose. Why did you choose that book?
Well, Satrapi's Persepolis, which is a book I regularly teach, it's a beautiful graphic novel, very eloquent. She says in her preface that she felt it important to show the world an image of Iran that is not reduced to what she says is the wrongdoing of a few extremists. She wanted to show something of variety, complexity of Iranian culture. Her family was of secular leftists. They were very opposed to the Shah's regime and welcomed the revolution at first, and then they're feeling equally hemmed in by the new regime. They sent her off to high school in Austria, and they see the West as a kind of place of salvation, but she really falls apart there. She doesn't fit in at all. She comes home, but then doesn't fit in at all well there. Finally, she makes her way to Paris, where she does this graphic novel in French. Very, very interesting. It's a very international character. Also, throughout is a real emphasis on women making their way as modern women in a still lingering patriarchy. And very important to her are the strong figure of a grandmother from whom she learns very much. And so it's a very lovely evocation of continuity and growth across generations.
Your own perceptions of Iran were challenged. You were quite surprised when you visited. What were the kinds of things that you picked up on that you found surprising?
Yes, I've been there twice, at an invitation of friends there. And before I went the first time, I always thought of myself as a kind of very skeptical consumer of American media. But I had somehow supposed that Shiite meant fundamentalist and very, very strict. And I suppose that things like the wearing of a veil were really oppressive to women. And indeed, Satrapi makes this a theme. In her case, liberation is getting away from wearing the veil, or how much hair you get to show, constant political thing. But when my wife and I went there, we were very struck to find, first of all, how cosmopolitan at least the middle classes in the large cities are. And staying down in Shiraz, our host was a friend of mine, a professor there. His daughter-in-law is a doctor and very professional woman. And for her, the veil is not in any sense oppressive. It's just part of how she dresses well. So her veil would match the color of her toenail polish. A very self-assured professional woman who, when he went to the grave of Hafiz, started reciting Hafiz poems from memory. Here you would rarely find a doctor in the United States who could recite Shakespeare sonnets from memory. But there, the classic Persian tradition is absolutely living.
Fariduddin Attar, The Conference of the Birds, is another book that you pick. Tell us how you discovered this and tell us the story.
I think I first encountered it maybe 20 years ago. I was editing a world literature anthology, the one which I had Darwish, and my co-editor for Middle Eastern material included some great excerpts from this book. So I first encountered that in excerpt and only read it entire for the first time for the sake of this project. But I love the fact that this is a comic mystical quest, which is also a political satire, and it's a kind of a rollicking good story.
The way you describe it is as one of the greatest narratives of spiritual quest and fulfillment. Sorry, no.
Yeah.
Can you tell us the story?
Yes. There's a group of a whole bunch of birds, 1,000 birds that are feeling anarchic, adrift. They feel they need a strong leader. One sensible bird, a hoopoe, says, "Oh, I know of this amazing regal bird called a simorgh. He's far away. If we find him, he could be our ruler." Then the body of the story, the Conference of the Birds, at this conference, they keep making excuses for why they can't go on the journey. They're too attached to power or love or wine or food, or they're lazy. They're just too attached to their own selves. Finally, a few of them make it. 30 of them make it to the simorgh after a long journey. It only takes up a very small part of the book, because the book is really about what stops you from spiritual enlightenment. They come, they meet the simorgh, but they're disappointed because he's not this great majestic figure. He looks just like them. And apparently there's a pun in Persian that simorgh would mean 30 birds. And he says to them, well, if 50 of you had made it, I would have looked like 50 of you. And that you have to look inside yourself to find enlightenment. So it's this it's related to the sort of Sufi tradition and the general mystical tradition. You can find the versions in Buddhism or in some Christian mysticism. You have to give up yourself to find yourself.
And when is this tale from?
Early 1200s, early 15th century. Attar died in 1221 when his city was destroyed by Genghis Khan.
Now you take us to Hafiz and the poets of Shiraz. Tell us who those poets were.
Well, Hafiz, I first got to know because of Goethe.
So Goethe was a German philosopher.
A great poet, a great dramatist, a novelist, a scientist, philosophical thinker, all in one, late 18th, early 19th century. So he's looking back hundreds of years to Hafiz and seeing a brother across the centuries. Goethe, who invented the term or popularized the term world literature in German, Weltliteratur, was obsessed with Hafiz. He studied Persian in order to be able to read him in the original. He signs his name in Persian Arabic letters. And he writes a whole series of poems called the East-West Divan, in which he is in dialogue with Hafiz. So this was quite fascinating to me. What was this modern poet seeing? And he sees in Hafiz a wonderful sense of a mixture of a transcendent self who's also attached to the world, both things at once. And the poets of Shiraz, there's a nice collection that I use for the English language reader that has 3 poets, including an important woman poet named Jahan Khatun. And one thing I try to have regularly in my book is important women writers. And she's quite wonderful. And her name means world, Jahan, and she plays on her own name, because often these poems, the ghazals, the poet will end by naming themselves. So often she names the world at the end, and she's naming herself in the process. And these poets are very playful. They love wine. Of course, Shiraz was where Shiraz wine came from. Sadly, you can't get Shiraz wine in Shiraz anymore, but you can go to Shiraz and see the tomb of Hafiz and these great poetic traditions.
And were they all around in the same time, Hafiz and these other
These other Shirazis? Yeah, it was a period of 100 years of the great flowering of the height of the Shiraz tradition. And then you get, in the same collection, there's another guy named Abaide, he's attacking Jahan Khatun because, like, a woman shouldn't be playing that. She must be immoral. He has these obscene verses about her that they're quite hilarious, but a little bizarre to read. So you get all these strands going on in this one town, but all 3 of them describe Shiraz as an earthly paradise. One of the poets says, well, if there's no wine in heaven, then why do I want to go there?
And do they all talk about the same themes?
Well, they all play in this classical Persian tradition. There's a great deal of use of repertoire of roses, of gazelles, of tears that become the ink in which you write the poem. It's all about the loss of the love or a mystical quest for the divine. And often in these ghazals, it's not quite clear if the beloved is God or is a human lover, or even what the gender of the lover is often left quite ambiguous as well.
Now, a few centuries after Hafiz and the poets of Shiraz, we have Ghalib. Tell us about Ghalib.
So Ghalib is a very interesting character indeed. Mid-19th century in the Mughal court, thought to be the greatest composer of ghazals of the 19th century. These enigmatic, usually love poems in little couplets, of which there's a thematic word, and every couplet has to end with a rhyme leading into that word. And very much in the tradition of Hafiz and others, the beloved might be God, might be a human lover. Ghalib wrote poems both in Persian and in Urdu, and he was praised in India as a great writer of Urdu ghazals. They don't read his Persian ghazals. He actually preferred his Persian ghazals, but because of the nationalism in which he's received in India, that's what they read. I think probably the opposite in Iran. But he was a very cosmopolitan figure of Turkish extraction originally himself. And he talks about the multi-religious, multi-ethnic court culture that he knows about. He's active during the time of the so-called Mutiny of 1857. He has a very moving diary about that, but just beautiful poems about himself, about understanding the world. His friends complain his poetry is difficult, and he says, I have to write difficult poetry, otherwise it would be difficult to write. Very paradoxical, very ironic, and very beautiful poet.
Lots of us know ghazals from songs. Presumably they were turned into, his as well were turned into songs.
Absolutely, and are widely known as songs today. Very similar to Rabindranath Tagore, whom I often discuss in that same, in the India chapter going on to this. Very well known as a songwriter. I have a colleague at Columbia who did a website about Ghalib's ghazals, his Urdu ones, and she was going to do just an annotated published book of all of his 200 ghazals, and that would have sold maybe 300 copies to libraries, a very scholarly thing. But then after 9/11, she felt the world needed to know more about this cosmopolitan poet. So she did a website, which is wonderful, called A Desert Full of Roses. You can see it, and if you Google Ghalib's name, you'll come up immediately. And she has the poems in Urdu script and in Devanagari script and in Roman script, different translations, annotations, illustrations, clips of musical performances. And she gets 14,000 views a week. That's 1 million views every 16 months, from all around the world, thanks to the web. And that tells you something about Ghalib's impact worldwide among people who know and care.
And finally, for the Tehran to Shiraz section, you feature someone called Agha Shahid Ali. Now, he's from that region, but he is in...
Well, he's from Kashmir, so it's not... I'm pushing a little bit the boundaries of my geographical range, of course, but that's literature travels. He himself, so just as Ghalib is coming out of this Hafiz-style tradition, Shahid Ali also is related to this old Persian tradition, and as a modern American or Kashmiri American exponent of it. So I like this for the modern audience, particularly initially Anglophone audience, to say, look, these ghazals are alive today, partly because of this migrant author, Shahid Ali, who was a great poet. He died tragically at age 52 of a brain tumor some 20 years ago, but he was a great exponent of ghazals. I got particularly interested in him with Ghalib, because when I did this world literature anthology, we have some selections from Ghalib, but it's very hard in English to reproduce the complicated rhyme scheme because every couplet has to end in a word leading into that rhyme. And if you try to do it in a new language, it ends up kind of sounding silly. But Shahid Ali would compose ghazals in English, so he already was working in the language and could do it. He translated Ghalib, and he himself is just very, very interested in thinking about this classical tradition and how it can relate it to the modern world. So a lot of his poems are about the Kashmiri conflict in India, and also a number about the Palestinian conflict. He has some beautiful poems set with that problem of cross cultures, nations, and religions.
So Agha Shahid Ali was writing in the US, composed in English?
Yes, so he moved to this country, I guess, after college and made his whole career here. And he was actually directing MFA writing programs in the United States for his career, while also writing all these great poems. In particular, I'm interested in the way he talks about this classical Persian Arabic tradition as a kind of a language of loss for him, because he doesn't grow up speaking either Arabic or Persian, so he doesn't speak the language of the sacred Quran or of the Persianate tradition. And he's not even writing anymore in Urdu, but now in English. So he's trying to translate across these cultures. And he has beautiful collections, sort of about this ironic connection to these old Quranic traditions as well as to the contemporary world. He has one collection is called "Call Me Ishmael Tonight," which is a line from one of his poems, and it's a beautiful line. He says earlier in the poem, "Who hears Ishmael?" And it's like his worry about, does he have an audience? Does he have a language? And since Ishmael in Hebrew means God will hear, there's an ironic play there. And at the end of this poem, he says, "God sobs in my arms, call me Ishmael tonight." And that, of course, is referencing not only the Quranic and biblical story, but the most famous American novel, Moby Dick, which begins, "Call me Ishmael."
You are a professor of comparative literature at Harvard, but you are also the director of Harvard's Institute for World Literature. What have been your observations of world literature over the decades?
Yes, I founded this institute about 15 years ago because I've been giving talks around the world, and people were interested, but they weren't being well trained outside their local tradition often, or maybe their tradition in relation to Western Europe. But world literature requires a lot broader range. And what I'm finding increasingly is a lot of interest in interaction, not just going through Europe, but of different regions looking at each other beyond Europe. An example of that in my own department of a young colleague in Italy now, was just publishing her first book on this on the uses of Quranic traditions by modern writers writing in the Wolof language in Senegal, in Egyptian Arabic, and in Indonesian, Indonesia. And she reads all these languages and is looking at how these Quranic traditions spread across the world. This, to me, is what comparative and world literature is doing today.
Which regions are the most productive?
That's a very interesting question. You might say the most productive, and a number of people thinking about world literature say this, tend to be semi-peripheral regions. So regions that are a very impoverished culture, that are off the map, there's not a lot of creativity. And the center, maybe there's a certain kind of reliance on what's already well established. Often the most creative are the semi-peripheral, somewhere in between. So in that sense, Pamuk in Istanbul is probably he feels peripheral to Europe, but he's not as peripheral as if he was in a village in Anatolia. He's in a very cosmopolitan capital of Turkey. So that's a semi-peripheral area. I'm very interested in Eastern European writers, interested in Thailand. I'm working on some Thai writers right now. They are never quite colonized, they remain independent, but they are semi-peripheral to the big empires. And this is often where you get the greatest creativity.
Why is that?
Well, according to people who work on it, they think you have enough of a sense of novelty. Pamuk talks about the fact that the great thing to him about being in Istanbul was that he could write about things that had never been written about before, because the Europeans didn't know or care, and the older generation in Turkey were so self-involved with the nation and certain national themes, they were missing things. So by combining European perspectives with the local information, he could create, Nobel Prize-winning literature. And he's one of the youngest people ever to win the Nobel Prize in literature.
Where are we seeing Or have we seen the Muslim experience best articulated?
Well, what I would say about the Muslim experience is what I would say about world literature, which is when you look seriously, there are world literatures in the plural. I would not think there is a Muslim experience, which is why the Quran plays out differently in Persia than in Indonesia than in Senegal, for example. And differently, I mean, my host in Shiraz, had a miniature Quran from his rear view mirror. I don't believe he can read Arabic. And indeed, very interesting, at the beginning of a lecture, they would have a recitation of some verses from the Quran. I don't think that anyone, and most people in the audience could not read those verses or even understand them. And yet the poetic power was absolutely gripping. T.S. Eliot, the great modernist poet, has said that about Dante, that the power of poetry, you can feel it before you can understand all the words. And that is nowhere more true than of the Quran. So I would say the Muslim experience, in a certain sense, is the experience of the Quran and of, to me, also the poetic traditions in very different contexts.
How is literature, its production and its reception, how has it been impacted by the declining interest in the humanities?
This becomes a obsessive concern for those of us who teach in the humanities. And I would say that for me, on the positive side, it forces us out of the ivory tower. It's very important to me that anyone who cares about literature needs to be evangelical. I'm a preacher's kid also, so I inherited some of that. We need to help people to see that I think that literature is the highest form of communication and of language use, and helps us to see into the soul of other cultures better than any other means, and can get below the level of the conflicts of the political discourse. So now the decline of humanities means you can't just take for granted that people will just read Shakespeare because Shakespeare is lovely, or much less Hafiz. So we have to be activists, and we have to find ways to bring this wonderful material to a general public, which is why a book like this is important to me. And also we have to be translators. I just published last year a translation of a Congolese novel written in French in Congo in the 1970s, because I love this novel. And I said years ago, this work deserves to be translated, but it didn't serve anybody's agenda. It was making fun of nationalists and making fun of cosmopolitans. So I thought, this is a work of world literature. So I said, I better put my time where my mouth is. So I translated it and just published it.
Tell us more about the work that you're doing.
So my new project is called Script Worlds. I'm very interested in the way writing systems often spread far beyond any one empire or country or language. So the Arabic script could be used in many different languages and regions. The Roman alphabet is a good example. The Chinese alphabet all around East Asia for a long time. And when you learn how to write a script, you often learn a lot of cultural stuff because you're given things to work on. I noticed this first with ancient Mesopotamia. If you were learning how to write cuneiform, you learned a lot about Sumerian literature, even if you didn't speak that language, because that's how you're learning how to write. And the same thing happens with learning Arabic, with learning the English script, anything like that. So I'm interested in cultural memory, how it gets conveyed, and especially what happens if a culture shifts from one to another, with the catastrophic success, as it's been called, when Turkey shifts from the Persian Arabic alphabet to the Western alphabet. And also how the new writing system can actually be a resource for writers. So you might have a sense of, I can do more than I ever realized. So you have, for example, in colonial New Spain, in Mexico and Guatemala, they had complicated old systems of hieroglyphics that only an elite few could learn. Then the Spaniards bring the Roman alphabet and force it on them, destroy the old books, terrible loss for the culture. But in the late 1500s, these old poets who are still alive realized, oh, we can write our poems down now, which they never did before. They were oral. So now they're preserved for us because the Spaniards tried to squash them. There's one manuscript of these poems, and one poem begins, Nikan and Pewa Tepanitsquikatl, which in Nahuatl just means, here begins a log-drawn song. But the word Nekan, the word here, has a big capital N. It's like, Nikan, here, it's on the page. So this is what writing can do for us.
when we do comparative literature, we learn what is different among the traditions and what makes them unique, but also what they have in common. Can you tell us, or do you have examples of that, or can you speak a bit to those kind of commonalities that we would miss if we think scripts are different or languages are different?
Yes, so I'm interested in this process by which, when you learn how to write, you learn a lot of cultural memory that comes along the writing. And a script can bind together a culture, and it can go far beyond any one country and be a means of communication, but it can also divide. So if you look in the case of the Near East, I give as an example and show the first person pronoun, I, in 4 scripts. There's ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, there's cuneiform, there's Hebrew, and there's Arabic. And when you see those, you look, oh, it's completely different worlds. But if you hear them, it's actually the same pronoun. It's ana in Arabic, it's ani in Hebrew, it's anek in ancient Egyptian, and it's anakum in Babylonian, the same word. So the scripts both communicate but also can hide.
And people would find that, the thing is that people will find that surprising.
People are often surprised by these commonalities. I have an Israeli friend who teaches at Princeton who has a book on the presence of the has a book on the co-presence of Arabic and Hebrew in Israel and Palestine. And she said, growing up, her friends in Israel thought it was amazing she could learn Arabic. It was so different. But she says it's not that different. My son, when he was teaching in Jordan after college, he made a little point of showing his students often the similar vocabulary between Hebrew and Arabic, which they've been brought up on the other side to think, oh, these are completely separate. But in fact, they're very closely related languages from the same roots. So part of my job as a comparatist interested in the world literature is to show people both the commonalities and why the differences are important. And differences matter.
What's next?
Right. So I mentioned I'm working right now on a book called Script Worlds. After that, I want to write a book called Babylon's Bible. And my theme in that book is to go back to my old interest in biblical studies and to argue that much more than biblical scholars have seen, that there's an intimate connection between the biblical writers and Babylonian culture, Assyrian culture, Mesopotamian culture. And my feeling is the pivot of this was this period of the exile when they're exiled in the 500s BCE. And they suddenly discover how to write great literature because they come into a great literary world. So this archetype of biblical exceptionalism actually comes out of a multicultural, multilinguistic world. And maybe, and along with that, one reason I so much like the ancient Mesopotamian material is that it already is multilinguistic, it is multi-ethnic. The very first known...
Why is it? What are all those languages?
So the purpose in all of my work is to push against the idea that cultures are watertight containers of themselves. There's one language, there's one people, which is a 19th century idea. There never was this idea before that every country only has one language. And in the ancient Near East, for example, the very first known patron of literature was a guy named Shulgi of Ur. He was the king of Ur about 4,000 years ago. And he commissioned a bunch of poems, partly about Gilgamesh, poems for himself. And he wrote poems, or claimed to. In one of his poems, he says, one of his claims to fame is that he's fluent in all 5 languages spoken in his court. So this is like the first small empire, but at his court, he has people in 5 different languages. So world literature is always there. And in one of his poems, he says, now I swear by the sun god Utu, that in distant days, in faraway places where people do not even know the written word, they will hear my songs and they will bow down to my songs. So the first known patron of world literature already imagines himself writing world literature.
David Damrosch, thank you very much for participating in Muslim Footprints.
It is totally my pleasure. Thank you.
Muslim Footprints is developed and produced by Kalima Communications in partnership with the Ismaili, the online platform for the global Ismaili community. This episode was filmed in New York by Mehraj Hakim, Amir Hakim, and Malik Nota. Here's the team at the Ismaili who helped put it together. Amira Jiwani is the series producer. Azim Lakhani is the editor, with assistance from Suraya Mirali for subtitling. Rasul Daya and Aleem Karmali have reviewed content and helped with promotion on the Ismaili website. Layla Sharif is our social media strategist, who's managing the Muslim Footprint's social media accounts. And Alia Mohammed is supporting with promoting the series externally. Shahid Karim, who oversees the team at the Ismaili, is executive producer for the show, along with me. We're grateful to our external reviewers, who are all members of the board of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. These include Dr. Nadia Ibu Jamal, who lectures on the history of Muslim societies, Ali Asani, who is the Albertson Professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Professor of Indo-Muslim and Islamic Religion and Cultures at Harvard University, Arif Jamal, Associate Professor in the Faculty of Law at the National University of Singapore, and Dr. Fareed Panjwani, who is the Dean of the Institute for Educational Development at the Aga Khan University. Additional reviews were also provided by Dr. Alnur Danani, who specialises in the history of Islamic science, philosophy, and religious thought. And thank you all for watching. Be sure to follow our social media pages, where you can find additional content and keep up to date with our news. My name is Aisha Daya, and you've been watching Muslim Footprints.